Los Angeles Chargers, their offseason in 60 seconds. Hired Joe Ortiz as their GM, Jim Harbaugh as their new head coach. That staff includes Greg Roman as the OC, Jesse Minter as the DC. Signed Will Dissly to a 3-year, $14 million contract. Big time. Brought back Alohi Gilman. Brought in Gus Edwards, Bud Dupree, Christian Fulton, J.K. Dobbins. A lot of guys on one-year deals. A lot of low-cost dice rolls for a team in financial transition. Traded Keenan Allen to the Bears. Released Mike Williams. Also lost Kenneth Murray, Austin Eckler, Gerald Everett, Austin Johnson, and Eric Kendricks. Draft-wise, Joe Alt in the first round, 5th overall. Ladd McConkey in the second round. And Jim Harbaugh's old buddy, Junior Colson from Michigan, at linebacker in the 3rd round.
This was the get your protein off season, and Lord, they needed it.
Blue chip check-in for the Los Angeles Chargers. How many did you have?
2.5. I had 2 for sure, and then another I was a little bit on the fence with. Justin Herbert.
2 for sure, huh? I mean, Justin Herbert, obviously. Okay, that's one. Who was the other one that you felt really good about?
If Rashawn Slater is like healthy, I'm very confident that he is that level of player. I guess when you bring in the health, it does make it a little bit more questionable, but he's that level of player for sure.
I was fine putting him in there mostly because I just think that he's going to look like a different player in this offense than he did over the last couple of years. And I think that there's a chance a lot of the offensive line looks a little bit different, and we'll get to that. So I had those two guys. Was Derwin like your half?
Khalil Mack, dude. He fits into my bucket, man. There is not a single player in the NFL who sets the edge like that, man. And he had like double-digit sacks last year. He was one of the highest
really good as
getting
pass
players in the
last
league.
year.
So kind of still does
I thought those
man.
days were over for Khalil Mack.
Did too.
And he bounced back in a big way last year. So the red chip guys I had were Khalil Mack, Joey Bosa, Derwin James. And obviously health is a question for all those guys. And we'll talk about Derwin a little bit later. I'm really curious what he looks like in this defense because it's been a really down couple years for him, and it's been sad to watch a little bit because of some of the highs we saw from him early in his career. But I do think that within this new system and with this staff that we have potential shot at a bounce back. What significant question marks do you have about the Chargers depth chart heading into the year?
Pass catchers. I think everybody and their mother has talked about this all offseason, so I don't have to say much.
You're not a lad head?
We'll see how many games he plays. It would be my question there, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And then the other one is basically every defensive spot outside of edge. Even Derwin James hasn't been healthy, hasn't been quite the same. The cornerback room, I'm not all the way excited about. The linebacker room, I love what they're going for. The efficacy of the play that we're actually going to get, who knows yet.
I think they feel better about the safeties than you do. I think Derwin possibly having a bounce back year, and I think they do think the Alohi Gilman is like a solid piece back there. Other than that, I'm with you about the defense. They got 3 good edge players. They got 2 safeties that you can rely on. And other than that, we're just holding out for dear life. And that was always going to be part of this, right? It's just that this team, it was a transition. Like they were going to have to turn the page a little bit. They were going to have to take their medicine for a year. And I think that's what this defensive depth chart looks like. And we'll dig into that a little bit later here. What are you watching for the first month of the season with this Jim Harbaugh-led Chargers team?
Are we going to get some adult linebacker play this year for the first time in Los Angeles in what seems like a really, really long time? But they've made all the right moves towards that. Obviously, so they brought back Denzel Perryman, which I think is funny, he is still banging around as just absolute car crash dummy between the tackles. And
SpongeBob SquarePants.
Yes, dude, like is it the best linebacker to have on the field? No, but if you need a guy who we can get something out of him in one phase of the game, Denzel Perryman's your guy. He's going to give you that. So I think that's nice.
As a 5'11" man, the idea that Denzel Perryman is 5'11" and weighs 240 pounds, so much respect. I mean, I've been 240 pounds before. I did not carry it very well. So the fact that he's pulling it off consistently, it's very impressive to me.
Him and the Landon Roberts, dude, just built like bowling balls of humans. I absolutely love those two. But then,
do you think it can come together? Like this group of players, what do you think the vision actually says, and how real do you think the execution of that vision might be?
I actually kind of like the 3 main players that they have. Obviously, Denzel Perryman is going to be your kind of veteran leader, bang between the tackles, gives you all that sort of stuff. Deion Henley I don't think he gives you quite as much in terms of taking on blocks. I think his run instincts can be a little bit more up and down, but he really does have good burst. I think he has good range. And I think you've seen, even in, it's just preseason, but in the preseason, he's actually made a number of really, really good coverage plays, like in the flat, running with guys out to the sideline, that sort of stuff, making tackles in space. So I kind of like him there. And then Junior Colson, he kind of reminds me like a little bit more of if Nick Bolton was a better like hook coverage defender over the middle a little bit, because I think Colson doesn't necessarily have any one athletic trait that pops, but he's kind of above average in terms of he has enough speed, he has enough quickness, maybe not the fiercest guy in the box, but I think he's actually a pretty smart coverage player, and can give them something there. So if Colson can be kind of your hook over the middle defender, Henley gives you something in terms of chasing guys out of the backfield, and then Perryman is just your we're going to go hit somebody guy. They kind of check all the boxes. I don't know if any of them are even above average players, but they at least check all the boxes, and that's a decent spot to be in.
It's notable that you're talking about it this way because talking to people there, and it was very early in training camp. I mean, this was day one of training camp, so we hadn't seen guys in pads, and things are subject to change over the last month or so. But I think their vision for that position was we're going to rotate guys maybe more than an NFL team would, because we don't think that we necessarily have two plug and play 3-down guys at that spot. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. We just think that we're going to have to handle this situationally. So the fact that you think they're incomplete players, but they all have certain highlights to their games, I think that's how they're seeing it. And so I'm curious to see what the deployment actually looks like.
Well, and look at the linebacker room we just talked about before. The Chiefs. The Chiefs are kind of built that way, where you have these kind of guys who maybe they're not perfect, maybe they're not complete, but they all kind of fit together. And if you can get them on the field at the right time, you're good.
When I'm watching the first month of the season, how different does this feel under Jim Harbaugh? Right? I mean, you can make a really solid argument that over the last 2 years, this was the least physical football team in the NFL. They were 28th in rushing success rate on offense, despite facing light boxes at the 4th highest rate in the NFL.
Oh, you can't have that.
You can't.
You just can't have. That's not honorable football.
It is over. Like, you cannot sustain offense in the NFL if that is the set of circumstances that you're working with. And that was the story. And then on defense, they're 28th in run defense success rate over the last 2 years. I had a GM say something to me last week that I thought was really interesting. He was saying that the Fangio takeover on defense, which really happened, kind of post Brandon Staley in LA, where you had guys like Ed Donatel go to Minnesota. You had Joe Barry come to Green Bay. There's a bunch of other examples.
Wasn't Sean Desai like a
Sean Desai goes to was obviously with the Bears, and then was with Seattle for a little bit, and then he was the Eagles defensive coordinator last year. And there are plenty of other examples. I mean, that was kind of the defense du jour in the NFL. Coaches love that. Coaches love that system, and offensive-minded head coaches who were staffing their defensive coordinator were seeking that out. You think about the Vikings, you think about the Packers, but players don't like it, because there's a passivity to playing that way. And I think that more than any team in the NFL, the Chargers fell victim to that passivity. I think a lot of people appreciated the way that Staley talked about stuff, like the football internet, because it made sense to your brain as it first hits you.
It's like mathematically, it's correct, right?
Yes,
like
mathematically,
logically,
correct.
It makes sense.
So let's make people matriculate the ball down the field. And then even on offense, it's like we have a cyborg at quarterback. We might as well have him throw the ball 50 times a game. Like, more passing equals good when your quarterback equals good. And so I think the ideas weren't necessarily rooted in the wrong things. I think that team over the last 2 years was just an example of what those ideas look like when they're taken too far to the extreme. And so I think the Harbaugh thing is just a correction, where it's a departure, where you're going from stuff that maybe mathematically isn't the best case scenario. We're running the ball probably more than we should in an ideal world, but the feeling of your team drastically changes. And if that can be the outcome here over the first month, like we watch this team play and we're like, oh boy, this feels different. I think that is going to go a long way for how we see the Chargers over the next few seasons.
Yeah, Jim is doing a different type of math where his equation is like, how many times do I have to hit somebody before they capitulate?
And Jesse Minter, I said, who's their defensive coordinator and obviously worked with Harbaugh in Michigan, said something interesting to me. He's like, if you want to be a physical team on defense, you have to see a physical team on offense consistently. And so obviously that's some like bullshit iron sharpens iron summer stuff. But I do think there's probably something to that. And the fact that that's what this team is now seeing every single day is a Greg Roman diversified run game that is trying to like hit you in the chin over and over and over again. I think ultimately that's a good thing. And I'm not trying to paint Jim Harbaugh as some like football Neanderthal. Like he hired Mike McDonald to be his defensive coordinator. And then Jesse Minter is somebody who I think did a fantastic job at Michigan. Like there are modern ideas here. They're just wrapped in kick ass. And I think that idea of a football team, that's where the Chargers want to go.
I think that's the thing. He gives off this aura of super old, doesn't really learn anything. We just want to hit people, and he does have the we just want to hit people mentality. But he's a very forward thinker, and he has been for a long time. Look at what he was doing with San Francisco and what they were doing on offense. Like he's very much a guy who's willing to look to the future of football.
What is keeping you up at night with this year's Chargers?
The pass catchers, man. I mean, that's really all it boils down to. And I know the easiest way to do this is to just look at the wide receiver room, right? Josh Palmer's a cool role player, but if he is potentially their best and known quantity guy, not a great spot to be. Previously he was wide receiver 3, and that was great. Now he might be wide receiver 1, and that feels a little bit worse. Ladd McConkey is a prospect I liked. His vertical speed and his route running is awesome. He just wasn't a guy who was very healthy in college. And at his size, where he's like 6 foot, generously like 185, that's kind of a scary profile. And I know that Devonta Smith is obviously that, but there's just not a lot of guys at that size who actually make it work. And so maybe he can, but I think it's to be seen. Also just a rookie, so you can only expect so much. After that, it's just, DJ Chark probably isn't giving you a lot. Quentin Johnston still has a ton to prove at this stage. And then, Darius Davis, really cool gadget role player, but not.
That's the thing is, Quentin Johnston is also just a gadget role
player.
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. And Darius Davis, truthfully, is like a more. It's much easier to convince yourself that giving a guy like Darius Davis is worth the little gadget role stuff, if that makes sense. Like just because Johnston feels like he should be more of a real receiver, whereas Darius Davis, I don't think that was ever the plan for him. So it kind of just feels like, yeah, we can treat him like McCole Hardman and this is fine. And we don't have to think any more about it. The bigger thing though, is that it's not just the receiver room. Where else are they throwing the ball? They have 2 running backs in J.K. Dobbins. I'm not going to
sit here and take this Will Dissly slander.
Listen, Will Dissly is going to do his damn job in the run game. I don't know how many high-impact passing plays he is going to give you. And I don't know how many high-impact passing plays beyond 8 yards you're going to get from a guy like Hayden Hurst. And then the running back room, J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards, I think the most either of them have caught in a season is like 18 passes. That's not a lot. And I can't imagine they're going to catch that much more here. So it's just hard to find where the targets go. Like they're going to go somewhere. I just don't know where.
My understanding in terms of how they handled this when they were looking at the draft is they didn't even consider drafting a receiver in the top 5. Like it was never a consideration. And I think they had chances to move down for like big hauls and decided not to do it because of how much they wanted Joe All. And they're thinking, and this is not wrong if you look at the history of the position, it's easier to find the receivers at different points in the draft than it is to find the tackle. So let's just take the tackle. And that's ultimately what they did. Unfortunately, you still got to find the receivers at some point. And when you're starting at 0, even if McConkey is a hit, you still need guys in some of those other spots. So this bet on we're just going to run the shit out of the ball and our quarterback is really good so he can lift everybody else. I get the thinking on that, but that is a tough bet to make when you look at this receiver room specifically. It'll probably be okay. Like, I don't think it'll be a disaster because I think the run game will be good and because Justin Herbert's good, but I think there's a pretty defined ceiling to what this passing game can look like in the short term.
I think that's the best way to put it. Herbert and this offensive staff gives you enough of a floor. The ceiling, I don't know.
What's keeping me up at night is just the talent on defense. Oh, we alluded to this a little bit, but I mean, they're really, really holding on for dear life here. We got a 1-year bet on Christian Fulton, who's had some nice moments, but there's a reason that he was available for what he was available for this offseason. Concerns on the interior of the defensive line. Like, we got Poona Ford and Otito Ogbonnia is like the starters on this team, and there's not a lot of depth behind them. Tyir Tark got cut by the Dolphins on a Tuesday. He worked out for the Chargers on a Wednesday, and they signed him the next day. Like, it was immediate because that's where this team is with the help that they need in that spot. And we alluded to this a little bit. this is a transition year. Like, they had to take their medicine financially. They didn't have money to make big splashes all over the place. And so they were going to have to kind of piece this thing together with duct tape and toothpicks on that side of the ball and just hope for the best with a change in mentality and so hopefully a lift from a guy like Jesse Minter. So we talk about a ceiling on offense with the passing game because of the talent. There's a ceiling on defense because they just don't have the guys at so many of these spots. And so I am a little bit worried about that, even if you're confident in the job that a guy like Minter can do.
It's, other maybe this linebacker room could work out. I have like some degree of optimism there, but this feels like one of the most stars and scrubs defenses in the NFL. Like, you have those three that
That's
we
been the
mentioned.
story with this team for like 3 years,
Yeah.
though. This is just taken to an entirely different level.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
I'm curious what the Derwin usage looks like, because I think over the last couple years, his head was just spinning because he's playing all these different positions, and he's playing all these different positions like within an individual game. And if you talk to Kyle Hamilton, which obviously that's an apt comparison here, same defensive system, a guy moving from the nickel to safety. I think that his role in certain games was streamlined and it was built on matchup. So it's like, in this game, you're going to play a little bit more of this. In this game, you're going to play a little bit more of this. So I think that limiting how many different things you're asking Derwin to do is going to allow his mind to just settle down a little bit. And hopefully we can see him playing with a little bit more confidence, because you could see the confidence drain out of him over the last couple years. And for a guy that, I remember writing about him and spending time with him early in his career. I mean, this is a guy who was just like a ball of light and energy and enthusiasm. And for that to be gone is just a real bummer. And so I really, really do hope that he can recapture some of that this year. And I think trying to simplify things a little bit for him could potentially go a long way in allowing that to happen.
I really want to see it, man. Because like you said, before there was Kyle Hamilton, there was Derwin James. A very, very similar, like, unicorn archetype at that position. So if we get him anything close to what he was at his peak, football fans everywhere should rejoice.
What are you most excited about with this year's Chargers team?
This is maybe a weird angle and like a weird way to set the table for it, but I'm kind of excited. I'm really excited to watch Joe Alt, specifically because it hasn't looked perfect early on. And when you really start to consider what Joe Alt was as a prospect, it kind of makes sense. He was a guy who didn't play a ton of tackle early on in his football career. Like, this was something he came to later. So it kind of makes sense that going into the NFL, where even if he was this top prospect, there was just going to be some degree of learning curve, but also he's going from the left side to the right side. And that's always a hard transition to make. I mean, we even saw Penei Sewell, who everybody thought just absolute superstar prospect. It took him a little bit of time to figure out left to right tackle. So
it's the exact name I was thinking about when you were talking about that. I think that we would just to see him as a superstar now, and we think it was instantaneous, and it really wasn't.
No, it wasn't. It was cool to see him have that development where it's like, oh, he really is starting to figure it out. And I think it's just, when you watch Joe Alt right now, you can see some of the really good plays. You can see some of the really good traits. You can also see a player who a little bit feels like he's just trying to keep his head above water. And again, it makes sense because he's a little bit raw at the position. He's moving sides, but you can see him get a little bit too far over his toes. Doesn't remember to bring his feet with him. All these other things. But then you see these reps where he just absolutely anchors somebody, and there's no shot that the other guy was going to get through him. And it's like, okay, if we by 2-3 more months in at the end of the season, he starts to look like that guy by the end. Oh, dude, I'm just so excited to see the development.
He's also 21, and he will be
Wow.
21 throughout his entire rookie season. He doesn't turn 22 until February. So you got a 21-year-old guy switching sides. There's going to be a little bit of an adjustment period, but I do think that we're going to feel pretty good about what comes out on the other side. And I feel that way about the entire offensive line. I mean, that's what I'm most excited about. What does this group look like? What can they get from Joe Wall? Can Zion Johnson take that step that we've been hoping that he takes? Can Rashawn Slater go back to being an all-pro level player? I mean, even some of the stuff that they were doing, like moving Pipkins and pulling him, and his movement skills are pretty good. I mean, he's a tackle. Like, he has those feet. So I'm really looking forward to what the Greg Roman influence looks like on this group. And then let's just throw Will Dissly in there as kind of like an extra sixth offensive lineman, because that's the bet here. The bet that they're making is more of a focus on the run game, more stress on that, and that being the foundation of our identity is going to unlock a different level from this group overall that, for the most part, outside of all, looks pretty similar to what it has over the last couple of years. I mean, you're swapping Bradley Bozeman in for Corey Linsley, kind of, mostly Will Clapp last year. But the other guys, I mean, 60% of that offensive line is the same, even if some guys have moved around. And so the bet is we're going to see those guys take a step forward because we just believe in the infrastructure and the ecosystem here. And I hope they're right, because if it does happen, this group would be a lot of fun to watch.
And I'm cautiously optimistic with Zion Johnson because to me, his biggest issue was just sometimes didn't seem like he knew exactly where to go on a play, or he would be a little bit late coming off a block, or he'd be a little bit too early and he would kind of leave his center or tackle out to dry. I think when you have Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman coming into town, that stuff is probably going to get ironed out just a little bit. So I have some faith there.
Most important supporting character for you on this year's Chargers team?
My most supporting, it's really two, and they play the same position. Tuli Pelotu and Bud Dupree. Like, they're secondary pass rushers, basically. And for a couple of reasons. One, Khalil Mack is getting older and Joey Bosa is constantly injured. So, like, those guys are going to play a ton of snaps. But even if they don't, if you can just give guys like Joey Bosa and Mack a little bit of rest, and we don't have to play them 80% of the snaps, and we can tone it down just a little bit, and you can get Tuli and Bud Dupree to be really productive players for you, I think that would just be a huge win. Like, if they can just have these waves and waves of pass rushers, that would be awesome. And I know, Bud Dupree at this stage of his career is probably not the flashiest name, but again, as I said with the Falcons, he was a top 2 pressure getter for that team. And now he's the 4th guy on this depth chart, probably. And I really like some of the tools that Tuli has in his bag in terms of like pass rush moves. Like, he's really a guy who clearly thinks about how to win and understands how to do it. I'm kind of bought in on the edge group. Again, I don't know about the rest of the defense, but I really think if those two can give you something, they're in a good spot.
And part of the reason I think Tuli's development is so important is Mack and Bosa are not both going to be on the roster next year. Mack's contract is actually up after this season, and Joey Bosa has like a $36 million cap hit. So there are going to be decisions to be made about what that group looks like in 2025 and beyond. Those decisions get a little bit easier to make if you think that Tuli can truly be like a number 2 rusher for you in like the grander scheme of what you're doing on defense.
Yeah, I mean, they brought him in to be Uchenna Nwosu, and if he can basically get all the way to that peak of what that was, they're in a perfect spot.
I get to go a bunch of different ways here for supporting characters. I'm curious what they get from the running backs. Like, if we're bullish on what the offensive line can look like in the run game, is there anybody in that backfield who can consistently get the most of what's blocked? J.K. Dobbins bounce back would be awesome, but how many times have we seen that from a guy coming off of a torn Achilles? Like, Deontay Foreman is probably the best example. Very rarely does that ever happen. And the other, just the spine of the front seven. Like, what are we getting from the interior defensive lineman, and what are we getting from that weird linebacker group that you seem more confident about as somebody who likes and watches that position? So those are probably my answers.
I think that's the spine is perfect for them because they probably had the worst spine of the defense in the league for 2 or 3 years now. So they desperately need this.
What counts as a successful season for this year's Chargers?
Just hit people in the mouth, dude. Like, that's it. Like, that's really all it is. And there are more eloquent ways to say that, where it can be, bring a new type of energy and really have all this other stuff. Just hit people, man. Like, this was, like you kind of said earlier, this was a defense that just didn't really have any of that mentality the past few years. And then even on offense, like, this just wasn't, that stat you mentioned about not being able at all to run into light boxes. That will never happen in a Greg Roman era. They will, if you give them light boxes.
Because they won't get the light boxes.
That's also true. That is also true. They will make sure
they don't. That's
the
point, right? If you don't get the light boxes, you still have Justin Herbert. Like, that is the goal here, is that one way or another, you are going to find a path forward. Because if you establish the running game, you still have a borderline top 5 quarterback, and something should go your way if that is what you're working with. All right, what counts as a successful season for me? The Harbaugh transformation takes. I mean, it's not dissimilar to what you're saying. I just think they feel like a different team. They're a tough out every single week, and you can take that, those results, and kind of take that proof of concept, and you bring it into an offseason where they're actually going to have some resources. Like, they're set to have $40 million in cap space next year. Joey Bosa is on a $36 million cap hit. Don't know if he's going to be playing on that. So even with Justin Herbert's contract, this team is going to have a bunch of flexibility to build out that connective tissue on the roster that we're talking about. Can you go get an interior defensive lineman? Can you go get a corner? Can you go find another receiver in the draft? And if you're working from a foundation of we have a certain play style. We have a certain feeling to us. This has worked. The bet we made on Jim Harbaugh was correct. That to me is a success. Wins, losses, whatever, it doesn't really matter. If they go 7-10 or they go 9-8 or 10-7, as long as that's true, like we feel good about who this team is moving forward, that's a victory.
Being a tough out is the perfect banner that they should hang, because there were games, especially towards the second half of last season, where they just fell over and died. And again, some of
You
that
mean when they
Justin
gave up
Herbert.
60 to the Raiders and
Yes.
everybody got fired?
Yes, I would say that was probably the most that they fell over and died. But even before that, there were games where it just every single thing went wrong. Like even the Dallas game where Herbert didn't play well. Even beyond Herbert not playing well, it just felt like so many things just completely fell apart for them. I don't think we're going to get as many of those games this year.
Irresponsible player prediction for this year's Chargers. What do you got for me?
This was such a weird team to find a good one.
It's a hard one.
It is a hard one. I went with Darius Davis being run away the best returner in the league this year. He had a punt return touchdown last year. He is a really good returner. He was awesome at it in college. It is like a majority of what got him draft status is that he's just really, really good with the ball in his hands. And so I just think we could enter a world where he's a really good punt returner still. And then with the kick return stuff, if there's a staff that I kind of have some inkling that they could do some cool stuff, it might be Jim Harbaugh and Greg Roman, like helping out a little bit. Like, let's make this look like a run play. So kind of a weird take, but that's where I landed.
I believe in Ladd McConkey. I think Ladd McConkey has more catches than any rookie receiver that's not named Malik Neighbors.
I mean, no, I don't think that's crazy, because Marvin Harrison Jr. is obviously the best player, but the Cardinals have a bunch of guys to throw to, so
that's
that
the
probably
reason.
won't. Yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
It says more about the rest of the supporting cast for the Chargers than it does about Marvin Harrison. And I also think that team is going to run the ball a lot in Arizona. You got Trey McBride, who's probably going to get 23% of the targets, and justifiably will. I just think that this team is so devoid of pass catching options, and I do think that he's talented. I could see him being like by far the highest volume receiver on this team by the end of the season.